coffee. Well, that's no fun.
We are talking the Vietnam War movie Ambush, and this is directed and co-written by Mark Berman and stars Aaran, Eckhart and Jonathan Rhys Meyers. I say stars, they're in supporting roles, they're the kind of the big names though, but they don't have a huge amount of screen time. Now, I'm actually quite a big fan of Vietnam War movies. I was born in 74, so I was kind of the growing up when the wave of Vietnam movies kind of were coming out, like the Platoon, Full Metal Jacket. So I was kind of that age when I kind of first started to see them. And Tour of Duty, a Vietnam TV show, is one of my favourite shows of all time. So I'm always quite excited to watch a new Vietnam War movie. This one, I believe, it looks like it's a lower budget one. And it takes place in the early years of the Vietnam War, 1966, and essentially it is kind of one of the early conflicts that involves the VC in the kind of the tunnels. So at this point, the Americans aren't particularly kind of used to it, and the crux of the story involves this kind of vital piece of intelligence that American special forces have kind of wrestled away from the Viet-Cong, but the Viet-Cong get it back and ultimately end up in these tunnels, and this kind of inexperienced group of soldiers have to kind of try and go in these tunnels and try and retrieve it. It's also kind of got to do with how the upper brass looks at kind of like the enlisted men and looking at more of a kind of a facts and kind of figures, if that makes sense, rather than kind of looking at the individuals. They're kind of just looking at win-loss ratios and things like that. So let's talk about what I think works in this movie. Now, there have been a few kind of low-budget Vietnam movies. In fact, 84 Charlie Mopic is one of my favourites, and that is a very low-budget movie. And U.A. Boll even did a tunnel rat Vietnam movie, which I actually think is one of his better films. So it can be done. What can I say that works in this movie? I would say the acting is fairly solid in this film, pretty much across the board. I actually kind of quite like the performances. Our main character is this kind of corporal, and he's in this kind of outpost, which is kind of near where this intelligence is kind of being gathered from. And he's somewhat inexperienced. He's only a corporal, I believe they say he is, but he's the one who's in charge of all these kind of engineers and stuff, and he has a lot of kind of responsibility put upon him. And I quite liked his experience of being this kind of clearly very young and inexperienced kind of soldier, but having all of this kind of pressure put on him, and the men that are around him as well that are not quite sure whether they should respect him because he's so young and kind of inexperienced, but he does seem to kind of look out for the men compared to, say, the more hard-ass, to use their words, upper echelons that seem more experienced, but maybe look at the kind of the soldiers as more chess pieces rather than kind of looking after their kind of best interests and things like that. So I do think there's that good performances and an interesting dichotomy about, what it means to win the war and how it's kind of viewed from different people up the kind of the pecking order ultimately. So I do think it does give some interesting kind of moral dilemmas in that regards. It doesn't kind of like beat you over the head with it. It's relatively kind of like subtly worked in, and I don't even know if some people will even notice that's kind of like one of the themes here, but it is one of the themes, and then particularly with kind of Aaran Eckhart's character, who looks like he's only done like one day's worth of shooting, if I'm honest, but there you go. There is a pretty good kind of like firefight at the kind of the beginning or towards the beginning of the movie. It's not a hugely action-packed movie. In fact, I would say 2/3 of this is actually kind of in the tunnels, but we do get a couple of close quarters kind of like fights and things like that. But there is kind of one larger scale kind of firefight kind of in the first act of the movie, which I think was kind of well handled. I mean, I wouldn't say this movie is particularly kind of realistic, but nonetheless, there were. I do think there were a couple of decent shots here, particularly at the beginning where we see all these kind of like bullets sort of coming through the kind of the mess hall and everything like that, the tent, and just like killing people unawares and things like that. So there are a couple of okay kind of action sequences, and obviously having these characters having to deal with kind of the tunnels, they've never really done it before, and at this point there's no real protocol for having to deal with them, and it's really kind of trial and error. It makes for it can make for quite a kind of tense sort of situation, and that's obviously clearly something that actually kind of happened, and people, real people had to deal with these kind of situations. So it's it's quite kind of terrifying in ways. You can never know what's down, around every corner. Is it a booby trap? Is it kind of a room full of kind of VC and things like that, or is it, is it the intelligence that you're going to be seeking and things? So I do feel there's that feeling of kind of claustrophobia, and some tension in regards to some of the kind of the underground kind of scenes. I have to say, I think some of the characters were fairly kind of well drawn out. Again, this kind of goes towards the acting to a certain degree, but I think they're fairly well written, and I quite like the kind of the bond between some of them as well. They're kind of like that kind of like soldier kind of brotherhood that you kind of you often hear kind of people in the kind of the military to sort of talking about. I think that was fairly kind of well realised, and it's a relatively kind of self-contained story, but it does have some kind of themes that I think would make you think about the kind of the larger picture, as I say, about the value of a man's life in a kind of a war like this. So what doesn't work? So having read, I watched this movie and I thought things just don't quite sit right with me with this movie. It is a lower budget film, but it just didn't seem all that authentic at times. And having done some reading afterwards, apparently a lot of it is not accurate to the time. The weapons, the uniforms are wrong. It's one of the things I noticed, and I've never served in the military, but even I could sort of see that it's not quite right. Things like the patches, the emblems, the fact that there's one guy with a beard, all this kind of stuff. Some of the kind of the dialogue seems very unnatural at times. It doesn't seem like things that soldiers would say. I won't give examples outside of but it just seems like it's written on a page. It involves kind of like the MacGuffin that they're after, I suppose. But there are some kind of some dialogue that doesn't seem particularly natural, and again, it feels like it's just written on a page. Doesn't seem like something that someone would actually say in a kind of conversation, particularly in country. So even some of the kind of for example, the stunts I didn't think were particularly good. You'll have like a grenade will go off, and you would expect the kind of like people to get blown a certain way because of the force, but they seem to go a different direction. Things like this. So it looks like it's sort of put together by people who haven't had a lot of experience, and that's conjecture at my part. I don't know if that is the case, but it just looks like it's kind of a little shabby here and there. Not kind of like particularly kind of well researched. I don't know if they've had military advisors on this particular movie, or if they did, I don't think they caught a lot, if I'm honest. So this kind of reminds me in a way of the kind of like the cheesy sort of like canon films, like Vietnam films, like the Chuck Norris kind of ones, and, rather than a kind of a more realistic sort of war movie. Exactly, it's kind of like it feels a bit more like a cheesy action film based in kind of the Vietnam War, rather than a depiction of that conflict, if that makes sense. So there's that. There are a few things here that kind of just I thought were, again, done for our benefit. For example, the tunnels are way too well lit at times. There's simply no light down there, and we have torches, but it doesn't give the idea that how dark that would be. No sources of light outside of a torch, and yet they seem like some of these tunnels seem to be kind of too well lit and things. Obviously, we need to see what's going on as a kind of a viewer, so it's sacrificing that kind of realism so we can kind of see what's going on. So I suppose, and that depends what you want from a kind of a a war film. I have to say the inclusion of kind of Aaron Eckhart's character and Jonathan Rhys Meyers' character seemed... I mean, I get Aaron Eckhart's character. He's a general, you know, he's kind of like miles away from a command post. Jonathan Rhys Meyers' character doesn't... He's introduced as this kind of specialist. But he doesn't really seem to do anything. You know, we're thinking, okay, you know, specialist's going to come into town, and he's got his dog with him. You know, he's using a shotgun rather than a kind of an M16 or something. Doesn't really do anything. I'm thinking, well, you know, just what's he there for? There's also some strange editing choices here. For example, we get this special forces guy. He comes to the base. They lose the kind of the initial conflicts, and they've lost the this kind of top secret documents. And this kind of captain or whatever he is, he's he's on the radio with the general and Aaron Eckhart's character, and Aaron Eckhart goes, "I'm sending you a specialist," and literally you feel like, you know, okay, well, when's he going to be here? But like, it almost feels like the end of the radio call, this guy's kind of touching down. It's like, well, he just immediately appears. So you don't get a huge idea of time, because that would seem like that would take hours, and then we kind of get like, you know, the mission is meant to be like a 2-hour runtime, which nearly runs for runs for a good hour. So they're kind of like the editing here, you get no real kind of sense of time, which makes it just seem very choppy. So overall, you know, I feel this movie, you know, the acting is reasonable. I mean, it doesn't help that some of the dialogue is bad, if I'm honest, but the acting is reasonable. But there are a couple of good action sequences, and kind of like, I quite like some of the kind of the close combat, having to use like bayonets and knives and stuff. But again, some of the stunt work is a little weak at the same time as well. So overall, it's a little bit of a disappointing war movie. I think this needed certainly maybe more producers on it. It needed maybe a little bit of a bigger budget. But it's okay for a bit of a time waster, I would say. But don't be expecting anything to kind of like to rival the likes of Platoon or kind of Full Metal Jacket or even like Hamburger Hill, things like that. So I'll give this one a 5 out of 10, and I have to be honest, I think I'm relatively generous with that. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.